Hey folks, Brian Smith with Vantis Commercial Real Estate, here in front of an industrial building talking about the pros and cons to owning industrial property. One of the pros of industrial is the fact that it's basically a big metal box. There isn't a lot of maintenance that goes along with owning most industrial properties, and from one tenant to another, the build out usually doesn't change very much. Whether we're talking about manufacturing type of facility all the way down to warehousing, usually it's just a lot of open space with one or two small offices or a grouping of small offices. And so there isn't a lot of changing that needs to happen from one tenant to another. The industrial has been in very high demand. The amount of supply that's available out there in comparison to the demand is quite low. And so the return on investment for industrial properties has been quite good recently, and in the near term looks to remain good. So since there is quite a lot of demand, refilling a vacancy isn't that difficult and usually doesn't take all that long. It's rare to have a specialty type of build out that needs to take place in an industrial property. Most of the time, standard build out will work for the vast majority of the tenants that you're working with in an industrial type of property. Now, as far as the downsides to industrial, usually it's one of the shorter term leases that you're going to have in the different asset classes. It's not uncommon to have 1 to 3 year leases in industrial. 5 to 10 year leases on industrial properties are somewhat rare. I grew up on a farm, so I think these metal buildings can look quite nice, but many people don't have the pride of ownership in an industrial building that they would in a nice looking office or retail building. So that can be a con as well. Because the leases are shorter term, and because the nature of industrial, you can have businesses that are either growing or shrinking. The space doesn't work well for them anymore. They need to move into something larger. You can end up having more turnover in an industrial property as well, although it's not as hard to fill the space back up again when the turnover takes place. And then in some cases, you can have tenants that can create cleanup issues that need to take place with a property. Let's say you had a business that handled batteries. Well, over time, you could end up with lead contamination inside the building that would need to be cleaned up. And it's very important in those kinds of situations to address that in the lease before you sign the tenant up and bring them in. Making sure that any changes to the facility that take place because of the tenant being there are put back to the original condition when a tenant leaves. Now, one of the downsides of an industrial property is many of the potential tenants you're going to be working with are construction based, especially here in the Sioux Falls area where we have such a booming construction economy, which is great from the standpoint of increasing the amount of residential homes that are being put up and other types of construction as well. The downside is those folks have the ability to build their own facility, and so rather than putting money into rent, many of them have the desire to own their own property or even purchase a piece of land and build their own facility to operate their business out of. So to an extent, you're competing with an owner-user as far as getting your property leased up. To this point, that hasn't been a problem, but in the future, there could be a trend that develops where you see more and more owner-users and less demand for industrial properties from a rental standpoint. Now, if you have more questions concerning industrial, I'd be happy to talk them through with you. My name's Brian Smith with Vantis Commercial Real Estate.